Thanks, Manuel. Well, good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Shawn Conley, and I'm the state soybeans and small grain specialist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Today, I want to talk a little bit about the front end of, these high oleic soybeans. And by the front end, I mean the production part of this in terms of growing the soybean crop and getting it up to the dairy side of things. And then we'll kind of turn it over to to the nutritionist to discuss this a little bit further. I'm from a dairy farm, and I kind of made this joke earlier that I haven't milked a cow since I was 19 years old when I went to UW-Madison, and I'm pretty happy that I'm an agronomist because I've yet to be kicked by a soybean plant. So with that being said, we're going to kind of start this off with kind of like a little bit of framework of soybean production for the state of Wisconsin. So part of the role of my job here in the state of Wisconsin is running the soybean variety testing program. If you look to the right of the slide here, we see that we run soybean varieties anywhere from Spooner, Wisconsin, which I call kind of the tree line up there, where we average 50 bushels per acre, all the way down to southern Wisconsin between Arlington and Platteville, where we're pushing soybeans over 100 bushels per acre. So again, we get a good range and depth of breadth of soybean across the state. This last year in 2025, it looks like we harvested almost 110 million bushels of soybeans in the state. We average about 55 bushels per acre, which would be a state record for the state of Wisconsin. Now, up until this last year, we hadn't really seen a lot of questions related to high-oleic soybeans, as most of these soybeans had been grown in the I states, Indiana primarily, part of Ohio, Iowa, and Illinois, primarily focused towards producing a high-value oil crop to be into the food industry. But in the last couple of years, we've seen a larger push, and from what I've been told by agronomists and farmers across the state of Wisconsin, we're seeing a lot of, I don't want to say pressure, but push towards implementing high-oleic soybeans into Wisconsin dairy farmers. So we kind of want to talk a little bit about that as we move forward. So basically, what are high-oleic soybeans? And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because the nutritionists will dig more into this. But in short, high-oleic are, engineered in a sense through both GMO and non-GMO methods to produce an oil with a significantly higher concentration of oleic acid, about 70% plus, which is, on the human health side of things and probably on the dairy side of things as well. It's a heart healthy mono unsaturated fat. And I had said earlier, there's increasingly become more and more influence in the dairy industry to implement these high oleic soybeans into dairy cow rations in order to boost both milk fat production and feed efficiency. And one of the things that we want to kind of touch on today is because they are a value-added crop, farmers often receive a premium or a cash premium to grow these crops. And part of the challenge with these, and we'll get into a little bit of this, is the whole idea of identity preservation and contracts in order to keep them separated from commodity soybeans in order to retain that value going into the dairy cow herd rations. So before we get started and before people go crazy with growing high-oleic soybean, these are some things I really want farmers to think about before they make that step. Number one, and I think this is probably the most important part, is first of all, as a farmer, do you have a market and how will they be processed? This is really important when it comes into some of the questions related to IP and moving these soybeans into the grain channel. And we'll discuss that a little bit further. But again, if I was a farmer, I would not be thinking about growing high-oleic soybean until you have a market already in place. Next, it's really important to identify, once you have that market identified, find that seed contract. I do know that through Corteva, there'll be a lot of Plenish soybeans that are primarily the ones you'll be hearing about mostly, but there's some other ones that are some non-GMO, high-oleic soybeans through Oleic or other industries. But many of these have either seed contracts or IP contracts that farmers need to think about and understand before they go down the pipeline of integrating these into their cropping systems. Next one I think is really important is make sure you have a contract with the buyer. Now, if you are the farmer themselves and you are growing the soybeans and you are taking them to a processing facility to get them roasted and you're bringing them back to the farm, your own farm, obviously you are the grower and you are the buyer. So it's all done kind of in a closed loop. But if you're not, given the fact of specifically with the GMO soybeans, i.e. the Plenish, these cannot enter the food channel or the grain channel. So this is something you have to make sure you have a contract in place in order to protect you on the back end when you're going to grow these beans. Because otherwise, if you don't have a contract and the person on the back end does not take delivery, you're kind of stuck with these soybeans where you have really nowhere for them to go. Because you just can't take the GMO ones to the elevator and put them into the grain channel because of European Union issues in terms of not being fully approved outside of the United States. Next thing is, again, will this work for your operation? As you'll kind of see through this is increased complexity with these productions. And you really need to sit down and understand the yield potential. What is that premium you're going to be getting, either feeding them yourselves or selling them to a neighbor, and understanding the return on investment for this increased complexity that you're going to be having. And lastly, if you don't aggressively manage weeds, specifically the glyphosate-tolerant water hemp, this is not something for you as a farmer to get into. And the way I like to think of this, again, because I come from a dairy farm, and I understand, how I'll call them cow people operate. You need to manage this crop like you manage the herd. And if managing a crop is not your forte, I don't think this is something you maybe want to get into, just for the fact that you could very easily have a train wreck on your plate if you don't manage the weeds and manage the crop accordingly. All right. So the previous slide, I talked about identity preservation or IP systems. And again, the primary goal for these IP systems is to prevent a quality reduction from mixing with standard soybeans and avoid export contamination. So again, if you look in the bottom right-hand corner here, you see a QR code. I'd like to thank Jordan Sattler for going in and spending a lot of time trying to herding cats and getting us to put together a document discussing high-oleic soybeans. And we'll get into more of the details related to either a hard IP or a soft IP. But the whole idea between identity preserve is make sure we channel these grains to make sure we capture the value of that premium that you're going to be taking as a farmer and growing these and delivering them to the end user, i.e. the dairy herd, or just understanding that these cannot get into the grain channel because of restrictions for outside the U.S. use. So again, that's one point. The other thing, as you go through and work with some of the seed contracts, there are some specific third-party facilities specifically targeted for roasting or crushing that must be approved by the seed company to ensure that those facilities follow IP protocols. So again, what I'm asking you to do is go through, have these conversations with whomever you're buying that seed from, specifically if the Plenish soybeans and you're working through Corteva, to understand who are those third-party and approved roasting facilities in those contracts to make sure that you have all your ducks in a row to make sure you meet these IP preservation systems. All right. Now, one thing I like to encourage farmers to think about is getting a good sense of, first of all, what that yield potential on these high-oleic soybeans are. And this is just an example of on the southern third of the state of Wisconsin, we're averaging roughly 80 to 85 bushels per acre. So I don't have a lot of yield data for how well these high-oleic varieties perform within the state. So again, that's something you would talk to your seed person to understand, what is that yield, if there is a yield penalty or not, or what that might be, and how those high-oleic soybeans perform compared to a standard conventional soybean in the system. Again, you can figure out what that return on investment is. So again, if you could maybe take a 5 bushel yield penalty, but if you're getting a Chicago Board of Price, plus add in addition another premium on top of that, encompasses and covers that 5 bushel yield hit you might take just by having a lower yielding variety. So again, things that you as a farmer need to figure out, and what is that value feeding through your dairy herd. Now, when we're working with soybeans, one of the interesting things we found is that in order to maximize soybean yield, you're really looking at planting early. Okay, so our early planting dates are a big deal for maximizing yield, and that's one of the most predictive inputs, if you will, for producing high yielding soybeans. However, some things to think about. We're balancing both yield and seed composition, which goes into that high oleic soybean content. Number one, as the nutritionists will clearly kind of go through and talk about, and they parse this out later, that you have to balance that nutritional value with our overall yield. As environmental and planting dates influence the oil and protein content and possibly the fast fatty acid profiles. Now, from what I understand, and talking with Corteva and the Oleic group, most of these high oleic soybeans are pretty stable. So I'm not envisioning a huge flux based on planting date. However, there can be some movement, but I don't think it's going to be anything that a farmer should be concerned about in terms of, changing their ration balance. One of the things we do know that as we plant earlier, that's what tends to increase our oil content and promotes higher yields. So again, depending on where you are, we tend to see earlier planting increase our oil content, whereas on the flip side, as we delay our planting date, that increases our protein concentration because there's an inverse relationship between the two. So again, something to work with your nutritionist once you get some samples out of your fields to really understand how well these go into balancing that ration. And ultimately, what's really going to be dictating from my perception of your planting date is weed management. Because again, this is going to be the biggest problem we're going to be dealing with at the farm gate level. And the reason for that is most of the soybeans that will be available to farmers in 2026 are either going to be a Roundup Ready only or a non-herbicide tolerant soybean. So what I mean by that is there's really not going to be any traits besides glyphosate tolerance in a lot of the varieties. Now, I do know with the Plenish variety as well as Oleic, specifically the Plenish, there might be a few varieties, a few bags available in 2026 with the Enlist trait platform that give farmers a broader spectrum of herbicides to be using for controlling weeds. But again, that's something you would speak with your seed salesperson at the time. But most likely you're going to be dealing with a Roundup Ready or a non-GM soybean crop that you're going to have to be handling and understanding that you're going to have water hemp resistant weeds. So in a sense, though, we got to be thinking about managing these crops almost as a non-GMO soybean weed management plan. And this is where Rodrigo Worley put in these slides, basically saying, in that sense, going in and understanding if you have glyphosate-resistant water hemp or a non-GMO, totally non-GMO soybean, planting early may not be your best option in order to controlling weeds. The best thing for you to do is maximize your weed control before crop emergence even begins. So by that, we're talking about delaying your soybean planting later into into like mid-May and even into later May in order to get a sense of being able to control your weeds at the farm level. So with that, the best option to do is either start clean, and you can either do that throughout pre-plant tillage in order to wait for that first flush of giant ragweed and lamb's quarters, which are earlier germinators, to have a lot of them already germinate and manage those through tillage, or that first flush of water hemp come through. The alternative is to have an effective burn down treatment, which would, if you're a no-tiller, which would be using glyphosate, which will control most of the weeds out there except for our glyphosate-resistant water hemp. Then you have to mix in a 2,4-D or a Sharpen, metribuzin, paraquat, another product in order to handle actually the burn down and control of that water hemp to begin with, but also provide some residual control. So again, understanding what type of system you have is critical. Next is to make sure you put an effective pre-emergence residual herbicide out there at that time of planting. There's different options here. We have our group 2s, our group 14s, or our group 15s. And again, understanding what is effective for your farm. And I would probably say most of the farmers will be looking at, for water hemp, first rate, a group 14 or 15 product in terms of our residual herbicides. There's some other products out there, some group 3s and group 5s. But again, it just depends on what we're looking at in terms of control of that water hemp species. Here's a good example of why we're talking about delaying planting. Here we see that early in May, when I preach early planting in Wisconsin, we really don't have any of our water hemp starting to germinate. So by waiting into mid-June, mid-May, we start to at least be able to control that first flush, that first 20% through either tillage or a burn down, and then putting an effective pre-emergence herbicide, layering that in to control weeds throughout the entire growing season. Okay. Now, in terms of a timely post-effective application, remember, glyphosate is going to be ineffective against water hemp most likely. So you have to be targeting small weeds, less than 3 inches tall, and layering in like a group 14 herbicide, which would be a Flexstar or a Cobra, just depending on label restrictions in the state. And then also prepare to come back with another layering in of a residual. And also think about if you are a dairy farmer and you don't have narrow rows, inter-row cultivation to control those weeds is an effective alternative. Lastly, as we're talking about these weeds, again, specifically for treating these plenish or non-GMO soybeans to be able to manage the weeds, narrowing your row spacings down is important. Your narrow inch, 7.5, 15-inch row soybeans can throw canopies 7 to 10 days faster than a 30-inch row to kind of help manage those weeds, but also layering in a cover crop. I think this would be a good system for a lot of dairy farmers in the state of Wisconsin, to be able to layer this cover crop in and then terminate that cover crop when that cover crop, in this case, it's going to be cereal rye, is roughly 30 inches tall. That will give us effectively a 50% reduction in the number of weeds that germinate on that field. So it's a good system. Now, if you are going to be planting green, as we say here, and as we have new plenish or Oleic varieties available, we always ask farmers to push their maturity group bean later than they would normally plant. For example, in southern Wisconsin, if you're normally planting a 2.0, a 2.2 bean, I'd ask farmers, if you're planting green, to plant something more like a 2.5 to a 2.8. Again, that just allows that bean to help recover from some of that early season competition from that cereal rye crop. And here's a good example of if you have a good cereal rye cover crop out there. On the left-hand side, you see the water hemp coming through, whereas you have that threshold of over 4,000 pounds. It's probably closer to 7, but gets to the point that having a good foundation of a cereal rye cover crop down there will help minimize the weed pressure we get from water hemp. So I guess in short, just to remind people, if you're going to be growing either plenish beans, understand that you're going to be dealing with a Roundup resistant water hemp, most likely, kind of treating the system almost as a non-GMO weed management specifically targeted for water hemp. Prioritize fields that don't have a lot of field history of weeds. Avoid early planting in order to make sure we can control the weeds, because remember, water hemp emerges later in the season. Maximize weed control before crop emergence. This whole start clean, stay clean system. This includes using an effective pre-emergence residual herbicide, groups 2s, 14s, and 15s. Make sure you're having a timely, effective post-application, which would be 3-inch tall weeds or less, and prepare for a second post-application, and then layer in narrow row spacing, cover crops, or inter-row cultivation. So I know I kind of talked really fast, but this is kind of the gist of what we're looking at here. I just want farmers to understand that if you're going to be going into this growing high-oleic soybean systems, be it plenish, be it a non-GMO version of that you get through Oleic or another source, understand that the complexity of your system is going to be much greater, and be realistic of that return on investment for that added work. And lastly, manage that crop like you do your cows, because I think that's really what's going to be ultimately lead to success, not just this year, but going down the road. Again, on the bottom right-hand side is a QR code of the article that Jordan Sattler wrote. And with that, I think I'll just pause here and get you all to the area that you probably want to talk to, which is actually feeding this crop once it's grown to your farmers. So I'll stick around for either questions now or at the end.
Thank you, Shawn. Let me pull up our slides.
Yes, and meanwhile, Kaylin is doing that. I'm gonna just remind you guys, if you want to send your questions or comments, please drop them on the Q&A option. That's it. Thank you.